يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Another class with regards to the Tawheed of Al-Uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as part of the Islamic Creed level 2. And after talking about the meanings of La ilaha illallah and the meanings of the Tawheed of the Uluhiyyah, the importance of it, the conditions of La ilaha illallah, it's important to mention something which is the subject of this class, is when some people they think that the Tawheed of Al-Rububiyyah, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His Lordship, is the objective of the da'wah, of the invitation of the messengers of Allah. The messengers of Allah were sent to call people to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Lord, is the creator, is the owner, the sustainer. This is a fatal mistake. This is something that is basically a fault and a falsehood that negates one's belief from the very beginning. So this is something that we have to be aware of. You know, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His Lordship, this is definitely a part of the Tawheed, and it's very stated clearly in the Quran. But the messengers of Allah, they were not sent with this Tawheed. They would use the evidences that the people already observe and believe in, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, the sustainer, the provider. They would use it as an evidence to prove to the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. And why we're saying that? Because the Quran says this. And this is, again, as mentioned before, this is how the people of Ahl Sunnah, they establish their belief. They don't make decisions of what their belief is and then they go look for evidences in the Quran and the Sunnah. No, but rather they look what's in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is where they get their beliefs. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He says, for example, in the Quran, قُلْ مَنْ يَرْزُقُكُم مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ أَمَّا يَمْلِكُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَمَنْ يُخْرِجُ الْحَيَّ مِنَ الْمَيِّتِ وَيُخْرِجُ الْمَيِّتَ مِنَ الْحَيِّ وَمَنْ يُدَبِّرُ الْأَمْرَ فَسَيَقُولُونَ اللَّهُ فَقُلْ أَفَلَا تَتَّقُونَ. Commanding the Prophet ﷺ to invite the people of Quraysh, the kuffar, telling them, who's the one that provides for you in the heavens and the earth, and who's the owner of your hearing and your sight, and who's the one that brings life from death and death from life, and who's the one that runs the affairs of everything? They would say Allah. They would say Allah. They would acknowledge that. They believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that does all these things. So then, فَقُلْ أَفَلَا تَتَّقُونَ. Shouldn't you then fear Allah and be dutiful to Allah and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone? وَلَئِنْ سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they would say Allah. This is with regards to the disbelievers. So many verses of the Quran that states this, and this is something that is well established meaning. So they believe in the meanings of the rububiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not call them kuffar because of that, but rather He called them kuffar when they disbelieved in La ilaha illallah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. So they would approve for themselves to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even sometimes. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, whenever they are in dire need, فَإِذَا رَكِبُوا فِي الْفُلْكِ دَعَوُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. When they are on the ship and there's a storm or whatever, they would invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely, purely turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved them, إِذَا هُمْ يُشْرِكُونَ, they would associate partners with Allah. And that invocation did not benefit them maybe only in the worldly life that Allah saved them, but does not make them believers. They're still upon a shirk and associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the tawheed of the rububiyyah, the oneness of lordship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not sufficient unless a person believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is how to seek the matters of salvation. So to understand this point, that the people of Quraysh, they were not, or their disbelief was not in disbelieving in the creation, in the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of the heavens and the earth, or for them to disbelieve that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the provider and so on. They believed that. But their shirk, associating partners with Allah, is when they believed that they can worship other than Allah, and they even mentioned that مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفًا. They said, we do not worship these idols except that they would get us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they even want to be close to Allah. This is one of their objectives. This is why they worship these idols, is to get them closer to Allah. Images of people that lived before. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called them disbelievers, mushrikeen, because they made an act of worship to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, it's the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the messengers of Allah have been sent with. And this is how the text in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and there's no differences of opinions about this whatsoever, there's consensus. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ called the people, and the jihad was established, and fighting against his people fighting him and rejecting him and torturing the believers based on what? Based on La ilaha illallah, which is there's no one worthy of worship except Allah. And they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why the Prophet ﷺ was inviting them for what? To believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship, and to stay away from the shirk or associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when it comes to the people, for example, when someone say, we already establishing the tawheed of the uluhiyya and we don't worship other than Allah, so where is the problem? The problem is in some of the Muslims today, when as a result of many reasons, one of which is the deviation, they would do certain acts of worship to other than Allah. When people slaughter to other than Allah, when they slaughter for the jinn, for them to be protected from the jinn, for example, when they make a vow to other than Allah, when they swear by other than Allah, which is a form of shirk, minor shirk, when they would invoke and make dua to other than Allah, asking someone in his grave to help them or so, this is major shirk. Why? Because ibadah is, dua huwa al-ibadah, as the Prophet ﷺ said, dua is the ibadah. If someone makes sujood to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is a very obvious act of shirk. Why is that? It's because we see it as a bad thing only, or because as-sujood is ibadah. As-sujood is ibadah. And we get to know that as-sujood is ibadah because this is what the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ upon. So the same thing, ad-dua is ibadah. So is it permissible for someone to make dua to other than Allah? Of course not. This is exactly as making sujood to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the grave worshipping and building masajid on top of the graves of those who are righteous, and traveling shaddur rihal to masajid that has shirk, wiping their hands, wiping their applications of work or job or whatever there is, invoking other than Allah, making nudhur, vows in these places. And they would say words of shirk and associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a major problem. So a person would say, but we're saying La ilaha illallah. Well, what's the benefit of saying La ilaha illallah? When someone would say Ya Hussein or Ya Ali or Ya this and that, what's the benefit then? That means a person is making an act of worship to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. La ilaha illallah means that every single ibadah is to be done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, not to anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is in brief, this mistake that people might think when it comes to the tawheed and the oneness of the uluhiyya to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. And you would find in some of the books even, people learn this. When they say, what is the meaning of La ilaha illallah? They would say, Ay la sani'a illallah. What is sani'? Sani' means the doer of things. Even that word is not from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, like manufacturing, doing something. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only doer of things. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that nothing happens except by the will of Allah, and He's the doer of all things. But is that what La ilaha illallah means? No, of course, the meaning of it, the only one worthy of worship. Every single act of worship, we only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala We don't make dua to other than Allah. We don't make vows to other than Allah or slaughtering or any of that. The ibadah is sincerely, devotedly done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. We'll stop here inshallah ta'ala, and next time inshallah ta'ala we'll start with, or continuing with the same subject, but to understand what al-ibadah is. So after understanding what is the tawheed of al-uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what is the worship? What is the ibadah? Because the word worship can have its own connotations in other different languages, but the word ibadah, such an important terminology that we need to understand it according to the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the way of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the Tabi'een and the Imma of this deen. So we'll do that inshallah ta'ala next time. Wa sallallahu sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية زاد
أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.